Cuban writer and poet José Martí was arrested at 16 years old for writing a letter expressing nationalistic sentiment during the 10 Years' War, an unsuccessful attempt at Cuban independence. Later, he became a political exile and dedicated himself to overthrowing the Spanish authority that tyrannized the land to which he was forbidden to return. But Martí increasingly became aware of another, perhaps greater threat, the unrestrained ambition of the United States. José Martí's Our America is one of the most famous texts by a Latin American. Published in 1891, Our America is a plea to Cuba, and more generally to the people of Latin America, to beware the seemingly unchecked imperialism of the United States. The stylistic language of Martí's text is important as the content and relies heavily on vivid imagery and metaphor. His animated prose is meant to appeal to the people on a level beyond academic contemplation or political discourse. Understanding that barricades of ideas are worth more than barricades of stones, Martí needed to encourage his readers to generate ideas through the rhetoric of his words. Martí's travels through Latin America, Europe, and the United States offered him a unique perspective in global politics. Above all, his travels disabused him of any naive faith that the shift from colonial to post-colonial status would, in and of itself, necessarily produce a just society. Martí recognized that he needed to plant the seeds in the minds of all Latin Americans, that the diversity of the region was to be celebrated. Moreover, Martí wanted his readers to reject the idea that the United States was the defining example of progress. Martí's use of metaphor and imagery is designed to lead Latin Americans to the desired conclusion. Our America is neither Spain nor the United States, but something distinct.
Martí's vision for Cuba and for Latin America was that of independence and prosperity. He wanted Latin America to flourish through its own culture and economy, through its own people. Naturally, this meant independence from both Spain and the United States. Near the end of the 19th century, and during Martí's lifetime, the main imperialistic threat Cuba faced was Spain. At this time, Cuba was fighting for their independence from Spain. Martí participated in this fight through the Cuban Revolutionary Party and through his written work, some of which included his famous Our America and articles in his newspaper La Patria Libre. Interestingly, Martí also viewed the United States as an imperialistic threat, although the United States had not yet directly done anything to threaten Cuban independence. However, the United States' influence was growing as they were entering the Cuban market. To some, this was significant because they feared a growing American influence would lead to Cuba's reliance on the United States. Consequently, it could lead to a loss of Cuban culture and autonomy.
To contextualize Our America is to look into the historical place of Martí and Cuba's role in the Spanish-American War. Our America was written prior to both the Second Cuban War for Independence and the Spanish-American War. The piece serves as a precursor and warning to the concept of U.S. imperialism that eventually took control of Cuba 7 years after. Martí, a Cuban patriot and instrumental figure in Cuba's Second War for Independence, was exiled from Cuba to New York in the early half of the 1890s, where the city, along with Florida, became a base to organize a revolution against the Spanish. This revolution began in 1894. The revolution continued past Martí's death in 1895 and coincided with America's decisions to declare war on the Spanish. Cuba and its people serve as a simultaneous player and setting for the impetus of the 1898 Spanish-American War, where the explosion of an American warship, the Maine, in Havana Harbor unfolded. The Maine's explosion, perceived at the time to be a mine situated under the bottom of the ship, was assumed to be an attack on the United States from the Spanish. The United States declared war on Spain shortly after. The war lasted a mere few months, with a strong emphasis on victory towards the United States and its allies. From April to August of the same year, the war ended with the United States achieving possession of several Spanish colonies, including Cuba and the Philippines. Martí determines that North America suffers from the tiresome task of reconciling the hostile and discordant elements it inherited from the despotic and perverse colonizer. The conceptions and tones regarding the national self in the wake of imperialism reflects itself throughout the entire text.
As we continue along with our outlook on the cultural independence of Cuba, it makes sense to acknowledge the lasting legacy of Martí on the country, especially including context from Castro. Though these men come at very different eras of Cuba, Martí in the back half of the 19th century and Castro in the back half of the 20th century, and even though these two men may have not been aligned politically or socially, they both had a vision for Cuban identity and culture which included liberation, as it may only be Castro that puts himself on the same hierarchy as Martí in terms of great Cuban patriotic leaders. For Martí, Cuba needed to be liberated from the Spanish because Cubans had their own identity and it wasn't Spanish. For Martí, it was necessary for Cuba to be at the behest of the Spanish government because Cuba was a different entity. Martí's life goal was to secure the complete liberation of Cuba and Puerto Rico from Spain, prevent Cuba and Puerto Rico's annexation by the United States, and establish democratic and free republics. Castro believed that liberating the Cuban people meant for equality of man and turned Cubans into slaves of the state. Castro reports on the economic instability of Latin America as a whole comparative to the United States. It's an anti-American sentiment that both leaders share in common. These are two men at different stages of a developing country's life in which they think that their assertion of power is better than someone else's. Martí will definitely be held to a better place in Cuban society than Castro because of his promotion of democracy. Without a democratic framework, there would be no Castro to try and revolutionize the work of Martí. We can agree that Martí was first class in creating a Cuba for everybody, and without Martí, Castro and communism would have never been given a chance to survive in Cuba. We started this project about Martí because that is when Cuba began to become their country. Martí was a man of literature, and our America presented his passion for his country and his anti-American sentiment, a sentiment that continues and has stood the test of time. Because of the anti-American and pro-Cuban beliefs, there had to be violence and a war. At the end of the war, the United States gained control of Cuba and remained in control for 3 years, until in 1902, Cuba gained their independence. Later on in history, Cuba was politically presented with the figure of Castro, the communist leader of Cuba who ruled the nation for close to 50 years. Under Castro, Cuba took on a new cultural identity. In conclusion, in the dialectic synthesis, Cuba's cultural independence only reached its maximum potential because of the work of José Martí.